Good afternoon, everybody, or good early evening. Thank you all for coming. And David and I began a very interesting conversation this afternoon, just about half an hour ago. And so I only think of this really as an interruption to a much longer discussion that's going to go on for the next 2 weeks, and which will be very exciting and very interesting for all of us concerned. Before introducing David, let me first of all thank the Institute for Strategic Dialogue of Laureate and Sir David Tang, who are making these events possible. So we're very much in their debt. And it's really wonderful that they're enabling us to put up this wonderful series of speakers from all over the world to talk about Chinese things and to allow us to do all these events around this that make it possible for us to continue the discussion. I also want to thank CRASSH and the magnificent people there who are amazingly efficient and amazingly generous with their time. Simon is here. Michelle was nervously awaiting our arrival earlier. She is here somewhere in the back. And Sally, who's been so helpful advertising the program. I think she is here too somewhere. There she is. So thank you too for doing that. David, and I'll be very brief because you don't want to listen to me, but you want to listen to him. David has been enormously productive, both in English and Chinese, and very few people can say that. His first sort of big statement in English was fictional realism in 20th century China. That was followed up with Fin de siècle splendor, repressed modernities, which was really a wonderful intervention in a sort of a rediscovery of all kinds of Chinese literature before the May 4th movement that has overshadowed so much of our understanding of 20th century China's literature. So absolutely groundbreaking. And then more recently, the monster that is history, which I would regard as a very brave exploration of facing up to all the issues of violence, revolution, injustice, suicide, pain, hunger, crime, etc. in 20th century Chinese history. And these are actually topics, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, these are topics that are very much continue to be sort of at the center of your concerns, and which I suspect we will sort of hear various explorations of as we go through the next 3 lectures and the symposium later on. I have the series of lectures, you probably have seen them, but I just want to announce them again today. So today is From Mara Poet to Nobel Laureate on Modern Chinese Literary Culture. And that will presumably be about Lu Xun and things like that. On Thursday, we have The Lyrical in Epic Time on Modern Chinese Literary Thought. So that is again Thursday, this Thursday at 5 o'clock here. On Tuesday, next Tuesday, so after the weekend off, on the 20th of May, we have Sailing to the Sinophone World. And I like the word sailing because I'm actually a nautical enthusiast, although I suspect it has very little to do with your talk. And then next Wednesday from 2 o'clock, we discussed this wonderful topic of the Chinesesness of Chinese literature. And of course, that's the kinds of issues that modern Chinese history, revolution, violence, and also all things that are really fundamental questions that are we're now beginning to talk about. All kinds of people are beginning to talk about. So we're exploring that with various speakers, including Michelle Hawkes from SOAS. We will also have Susan de Rivera from here, and we will have Julia and Tianjin from Newcastle, and finally even myself, although I don't know anything about literature, but I will bring in the outside world. Anyway, with that, please do welcome me join me in welcoming David.
Thank you very much. Well, let me say this is a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is truly a wonderful occasion for me to visit Cambridge again. Last time when I was here probably was about 30-some years ago, and I stayed here only for 1 hour as a busy tourist. I don't think I even got to see St. Catherine's College where I am staying. But definitely, I'm very happy to travel from the young or new Cambridge to the old Cambridge, and to share with you my personal thoughts on the twists and turns of Chinese literary history from the turn of the 20th century to the turn of the 21st century. I wanted to take this opportunity first to thank my colleagues in association with CRASSH, and particularly Simon. And of course, I want to thank my colleagues, Professor Hans van der Laan and Susan Daravallo for their coordination and invitation. I'm going to give a series of 3 lectures regarding the dynamics of modern Chinese literary culture. For today, I'm going to talk about the changes and the continuities of this culture, and trying to probe for questions that may have concerned or interested us, but we have yet to find the final or conclusive answers. Hopefully, I could provide a few more observations in our way to further elucidate or define this very active development of modern Chinese literature from the early modern period to the contemporary era. And as Hans mentioned just now, on Thursday, when I'm coming back, I'm going to talk about some aspects of modern Chinese literary studies we have yet to explore. That is the tradition of modern Chinese literary thought, as opposed to theory, which we are familiar with and are making good use of it almost on an everyday basis. And next week, on Tuesday again, I am going to talk about a new prospect of modern Chinese literary studies, that is Sinophone studies. And so altogether, the 3 topics hopefully will touch upon 3 aspects of modern Chinese literary studies or Chinese literary cultural dynamics in general. That is the cultural issue, the intellectual issue, and intellectual issues amid historical dynamics, particularly the geopolitical aspect of Chinese literary studies. So let me start with today's first question. That is why we are talking about Chinese literary culture rather than just merely Chinese literature. Here, I would like to define Chinese, literary culture not as merely a corpus of textual evidence. Instead, I would like to see the changes and the transformations of modern Chinese literature as a kind of a cultural phenomenon, as a kind of a constellation of various tastes, discourses, productions, consumption behaviors, and, of course, the eventual reflections upon the consequences of these cultural endeavors. And, of course, I would like to also examine this cultural phenomenon against the historical dynamics. Again, I believe history is part of our inquiry into any kind of literary movement or changes and continuities throughout the century. So that probably will serve as the bottom line of my exploration. And I would like to argue that this is, of course, a big topic, and I can hardly exhaust the rich potentials of this topic. For today, I would like to focus upon 3 particular moments, 3 moments which seem to me are most crucial to our understanding of the changes of Chinese literary culture. The 3 moments are the Late Qing moment, or the so-called pre-May 4th moment. And the second moment, the pre-1949 moment, the eve of Chinese Communist Revolution. And then the third moment, the contemporary era. And also, I would like to invoke 3 figures or icons, so to speak, as points of departure to my survey of the 3 moments. The 3 icons or figures are, to begin with, Mara, and followed by homunculus. This is kind of odd, but I'll explain right away. And thirdly, Nobel. And you probably are curious about my motivation, why in a lecture about modern Chinese literary culture, I actually make references to foreign names. But probably that is some issue we want to engage with in the session of questions and answers. But here, let me just argue again. For our understanding of literary culture, theoretically, I refer to scholars such as Sheldon Pollock or Michel Hawks, my colleague at SOAS, trying to see literature not merely as a kind of aesthetic endeavor, but as a kind of continuum of a different kind of approaches to the formation of Chinese traditions we called 文学. Here, just very briefly, I want to argue that for 文学, I don't see the 文 on the screen right here now. But anyway, etymologically speaking, this 文 in the context of Chinese 文学 actually means a lot. More than just belles lettres, just a kind of literature as we understand and define it today. Instead, 文 in traditional Chinese civilization could refer to ornamentation, 文饰, or just fine, beautiful writing, 文艺, or learning and scholarship, or culture and upbringing and propensity, 文化气质, and finally, 文明, civilization. So when we talk about 文学 or literature, even in modern or contemporary context, we still want to keep in mind that there is a long literary tradition that substantiated this continued development of Chinese literature. And also we want to consider human agency involved in the formation and the disintegration of this new culture. With these factors in mind, now I proceed to part one of today's talk. The first talk has to do with the subject or the figure Mara. And this is definitely a peculiar term for those who don't know much about the rise of modern Chinese literature. Let me just first relate the story and then explain my personal take upon this figure. That is, in the year 1908 in Japan, there was a student-run magazine called Henan. In the February and March issue, an article was being published titled On Mara Poet. The author, whose pen name at that time was Lin Fei, was later better known as Lu Xun, the founding father of modern Chinese literature and cultural politics. Lu Xun at that time was a 27-year-old overseas Chinese student, pondering day and night the possibilities of Chinese future. And the conclusion he drew from his prior experience was that to renovate or reinvigorate Chinese fate, we must try first to reform Chinese literature. But how do we do it? According to Lu Xun, in 1908, we ought to celebrate the Mara spirit. And the Mara spirit is a kind of a powerful kind of figure of speech, so to speak, for Lu Xun. Something supposedly drove that generation of Chinese intellectuals in pursuit of national reform and the Renaissance. But this Mara, this particular term, is a peculiar term to contemporary Chinese readers too. Mara actually was a term drawn from Sanskrit scripture. Mara, in its original context, refers to devil or diabolic being, and so on and so forth. In other words, when we talk about the fashioning of the new Chinese cultural and literary subjectivity, Mara now was being invoked as that something fiendish, something sort of inscrutable, something destructive, a kind of a new agency which will force Chinese readers and intellectuals to transform the status quo in the hope of a better future. So Mara here really sort of cultivates a kind of a double bind in the Chinese mindset as to what makes of literature. Instead of the traditional concept, literature is that benign and sometimes very tame undertaking which helps cultivate the Chinese sort of sensibilities and sometimes in collaboration with political orthodoxy. Here, the young Lu Xun wanted to argue instead that Mara is that devilish destructive power. That's something we can never foresee what kind of consequences this kind of a creature will bring about. So that's the point when Lu Xun argued for a kind of a spiritual warrior, a kind of image, a kind of a historical agency, which will, with quotation marks, which will pluck Chinese hearts, 因人心者, right, to disturb Chinese mentality in the hope that somehow, someday, China could be reformed in a new and unexpected way. So that's the Mara power, which was professing by Lu Xun at the time. And now, the time, let me try again, was 1987. And here, for Lu Xun, we need to summon the satanic power to transgress and demolish the status quo, that giving his poetic vision a negative, even sometimes demonic thrust. And this is, of course, 1908. And for Lu Xun, who would have been the archetypes of this Mara images? On the China side, probably this Mara spirit can be traced as far back as 2,500 years ago in the name of Qu Yuan, supposed to be the originator of this kind of a negative, destructive power in the hope of reforming Chinese civilization. But still, for Lu Xun, this Qu Yuan was too weak a kind of a model for modern Chinese scholars, intellectuals to emulate. Instead, Lu Xun argued that we Chinese should find a new source of inspiration in Western literature. And among all those Western models he was reviewing at the time, Lord Byron came out to be the model Lu Xun wanted to celebrate as a kind of a new direction or new source of inspiration for Chinese readers, writers, and intellectuals to pursue. And now we want to think about, again, the year 1908, just 3 years before the fall of the Qing Empire, followed by the founding of the Republic of China. Lu Xun was just about to wrap up his work in Japan, and by then he had already transferred from medical school to the engagement with literature. So this probably brings us to his recollection of his decision between 1906, the year of his transfer, and 1908, the year when he came out with this powerful manifesto, Mara Poet. As a preface of Lu Xun's collection of short stories, Call to Arms, or Nahan, indicate the collection was published in 1922. In that preface, Lu Xun recalled, sort of retroactively, the reason or the motivation for him to make the transfer from the medical school to becoming a literature major. As a legend or the story wrote, according to Lu Xun, in the year 1906, in a classroom of biochemistry, he was given to view a slideshow, just possible this one, we are never sure anymore. In the slideshow, a Chinese culprit was being just about be beheaded, surrounded by a group of spectators of Japanese soldiers as well as Chinese people. The context of this capital punishment, that was 1905, the Russo-Japanese War. And the picture was nevertheless taken in Manchuria. For young Lu Xun at that time, the question was like this: why Japan and Russia were fighting a war and made Manchuria their battlefield? why, when the war was being fought between these two foreign countries, a Chinese was willing to serve as a kind of spy for the Russian side, only to be captured and to be decapitated on this particular scene. And finally, why, when one of their compatriots was about to be decapitated, Chinese people were being summoned to serve as spectators, as if they were enjoying a bloody spectacle. So right after that, famously, Lu Xun wrote in his preface to A Call to Arms. At that time, I came to realize that the uselessness of being a medical school major. Even if I could rescue a single human body, Chinese human body, I could never rescue or save the soul of that body. And for him, at that moment, referring to the year 1906, to rescue or save the Chinese soul, literature is supposed to be the most important source of doing this incredible mission. So that sort of served as a kind of motivation, not only for Lu Xun's personal choice of literature over other intellectual undertakings, but also for one whole generation of Chinese intellectuals who decided to engage themselves in literary politics as one way to reform and renew China. So in a way, from 1908, sort of looking backward to 1906, we could sort of sense this tremendous sort of momentum driving young Lu Xun and other like-minded young intellectuals to think and rethink the potency or the agency of Chinese literature. So probably even at that point, we could already say that Chinese literature, the modern sort of version of Chinese literature, was a sort of rooted in a very strong political commitment at the beginning point. And at this moment, I want to argue that such a strong sense of literary politics could be even further traced back to the case of Liang Qichao, and chronologically, this pushes us even further back to the beginning of the 20th century. Now the time was 1902. Again, in Japan, in Yokohama, Liang Qichao, who was at that time in exile as a result of the 1898 coup, and tried to think of literature as a kind of a new vehicle through which to engage Chinese politics again. At that time, Liang Qichao was promoting three kinds of revolutions, so-called poetry revolution, prose revolution, and above all, fiction revolution. And to serve that purpose, he founded the magazine called the 新小说, or New Fiction, in 1902. And in the preface, or the manifesto of this new magazine, Liang Qichao argued forcefully and famously, to renovate the people of a nation, the traditional literature of the nation must first be renovated. Thus, to renovate morality, we must first renovate fiction. To renovate religion, we must first renovate fiction. To renovate manners, we must first renovate fiction. To renovate learning in the arts, we must first renovate fiction. And even to renovate people's hearts and remold their character, we must first renovate fiction. It sounds really good for people like us doing literature. And we had this wonderful sort of a propaganda type of a manifesto in support of something we now call the literature. And why, according to Liang Qichao, why literature in general or fiction in particular has such a kind of incredible power? Well, the answer is a kind of a no answer. It is because fiction exercises a power of inconceivable magnitude over mankind. So just think about at the turn of the 20th century, with only 6 years apart, you have Liang Qichao, the sort of enlightened conservative on the one hand, and Lu Xun, 1908, the radical sort of revolutionary type of intellectual, both trying to argue for a kind of a cultural undertaking we now call literature as the only way out for China's future. So this is the moment which I would like to argue as a kind of extraordinary encounter between the traditionally trained intellectuals and the new historical momentum. We now call it either reform, revolution, renaissance, or whatever. No matter what, in just 3 years, right after the publication of Lu Xun's Mara Poet, the revolution did take place. And we do see this incredible destructive power supposedly generated by literature now being put into practice for a new kind of political platform of China's search of her own modernization. But again, we want to think about the ambiguities at this point of either Liang Qichao's argument or Lu Xun's argument. And here we want to say that, literature was never purely just a kind of ontological being, always already there in Chinese tradition, either the past or the present. Instead, the literature, as we understand it, as a kind of intellectual discipline, wasn't introduced to China till the year 1902. Actually, was mandated by the Empress Dowager as a kind of a new form through which to train the younger generation of Chinese intellectuals. And it was not till 1904 literature was formally introduced as a kind of academic discipline in the Chinese equivalent to Western university system. So from this perspective, literature was actually enjoying a kind of a very short sort of period of life throughout the modern century, probably just 100 years or so. And here on the screen, you see the two photos. One photo of the first literary history penned by or written by Lin Chuanjia in 1904. And the same year, on the right side, Huang Ren, based at the Suzhou University, also wrote a kind of a literary history. Of course, in a very a different form as we understand the term today. So this marked the beginning of the production of a kind of a literary knowledge in terms of a literary history, and certainly something new for that generation of Chinese readers and intellectuals. Now, to conclude this part, I want to make two arguments about the manifestos presented by Lu Xun as well as Liang Qichao. That is, for Lu Xun, as I argue that Mara Poet is truly a kind of extraordinary image of Chinese literary agency. If traditionally we are thinking of literature as that which cultivates a good Chinese the citizenry in terms of Confucian cultivation, now this new image of a Mara Poet is anything but tame and benign. Actually, Mara Poet is supposed to be diabolic, supposed to be destructive, supposed to be dangerous. So that's probably something the earlier generation of Chinese intellectuals could hardly have imagined. On the other hand, as you could tell on the screen, Liang Qichao's argument about the necessity of renovating Chinese fiction also entertains its own kind of a counter-argument. That is, for Liang Qichao, traditional literature, the majority of traditional literature, particularly fiction, was actually a dangerous genre, a dangerous cultural engagement. As intellectuals, we ought to be always very careful about the consequences of professing literature, with quotation marks. But now, almost in a kind of a Platonic gesture, Liang Qichao was arguing that we should exclude those bad practitioners of literature so as to really honor the very treasurable nature of Chinese citizenry. But somehow, 1902, when Liang Qichao came up with a new agenda about fiction, he seems to be turning table round. That is, traditionally, fiction was regarded as the most debased genre in the literary hierarchy. But now, 1902 marked the moment when Liang Qichao wanted to say that we actually want to turn the whole traditional literary generic hierarchy upside down. Now, instead of debunking fiction, we want to celebrate fiction as that dangerous, seductive, and yet powerful vehicle through which we can do something impossible. That is, reform Chinese culture and civilization over again. So underlining Liang Qichao's argument is a kind of a traditional Chinese concept, which I, of course, paraphrase as yi du gong du, to set a poison to cure a poison. If fiction was regarded as dangerous because of its sort of a seductive power, now let us, the younger generation of intellectuals, make good use of this seductive and poisonous power in the hope that literature somehow, someday, could really transform Chinese culture. So in a way, I'm talking about the double bind, sort of underlining either Lu Xun's or Liang Qichao's argument about the literature. And I also want to argue that such a kind of double bind eventually would become a tremendous challenge for Chinese politicians, statesmen, and cultural leaders, as well as literature practitioners, when they came to terms with the true nature of literature in modern China. It is this kind of slippery quality that again sort of drives us to consider what constitutes the Mara of Mara literature. If this is a Mara literature, the La Jeunesse, Xingjian, the most important literature magazine, first coming out in 1915, allegedly serving as the forerunner for the whole May 4th literary reform movement. This is supposed to be something forbidden, something destructive, and yet something revolutionary. Or is this the Mara literature we were talking about, the so-called Mandarin ducks and the butterfly fiction, in today's terminology, trashy romance? And when Liang Qichao and Lu Xun and so on and so forth wanted to do away with the trashy romance, the Mandarin ducks and the butterfly fiction, but somehow, much to their chagrin, the majority of Chinese readers, either enlightened or not enlightened, could still not consume enough this wonderful sort of genres. They love this kind of trashy romance, from sentimental romance all the way to a social expose, to chivalric novel, or to historical saga. So is this the Mara we are talking about? Is this the poisonous, destructive power of fiction, which nevertheless sort of found its own way, kind of creepily coming back to the canon of Chinese literature? So again, when we're looking at the scene of modern Chinese literature, we have to observe this kind of a continued dialogical or even dialectical sort of a contestation among different kind of claims as to what makes literature in modern China. To conclude, can we consider Ba Jin, the anarchist writer of modern China, as a Mara poet? Or should we consider Guo Moruo, the once upon a time the ultimate Chinese romantic, right? And eventually a romantic turned a communist revolutionary and finally a Maoist. Is he qualified for being a Mara poet? Or Mr. Zhang Henshui, Mr. Zhang who hates water, a literal translation of his pen name, this king of Mandarin ducks and butterfly fiction. Throughout his life, he produced more than 100 novels, and even Lu Xun's mother was a fan of Zhang Henshui's fiction, although her son was engaged with new literature. Or finally, these modernists, the so-called Shanghai new sensationalists, they are modernists and they are decadent, they are avant-garde, they were able to do anything against the mainstream literature. And they certainly made their voices being heard at once upon a time in 1930s Shanghai. So again, through parading these images, I'm arguing that Mara, in the end, became a very dubious sort of a designation, a kind of sort of unstable kind of terms through which we have to negotiate again as to the quality of modern Chinese literature. So with this, I conclude the first part of my survey of the modern Chinese literary culture. Now, I'm going to part two. That is homunculus. This is a term which was being hidden in the abstract of my talk. This is a bizarre term, and I will explain immediately why it matters to our understanding of modern Chinese literary culture. But before I do that, I will first tell a story. The time now was 1936. The figures involved in my stories are Feng Zhi, Shen Congwen, and He Qifang. And let me just introduce who these people were and why they play sort of interesting roles in my discussion of this whole image of homunculus in 1940s. Feng Zhi was known by late 1930s as the most important lyricist in modern China. And he was praised by Lu Xun as the most talented poet in China. And in his own right, he was also a good scholar, a strong scholar in Germanic studies. 1936 marked the end of his 6-year-long sojourn in Heidelberg. He was in Heidelberg for 6 years studying Goethe, Rilke, and other German writers. And he came back to China and was just about to start his career in China one more time. Shen Congwen, probably some of the audience here know who he was. Arguably the most important writer of Chinese regionalism. And his lyrical style, his native style of writing fascinated generation after generation of Chinese readers from 30s to date. In 1936, Shen Congwen was a well-known professor and also a leading editor in one of the most important newspapers in China. This is a newspaper based in Tianjin, Dagong, and he was responsible for the literary supplement of this newspaper. And through his reading of young writers' contributions to this supplement, Shen Congwen came to know Mr. He Qifang, who just got his degree from the philosophy department of Beijing University the year before. This is a young but extremely talented poet who was mostly inspired by French modernism and British modernism of the models he wanted to emulate Baudelaire, T.S. Eliot, Paul Valéry, and so on and so forth. So truly, this is a young poet well immersed in the Western sort of symbolist and modernist tradition. Meanwhile, his poems fascinated numerous young people at the time. They are subtle, they're delicate, and of course, they are very sentimental, mostly romantic poetry. So this is a time, 1936. Now, we want to take a quick leap to the next moment, 1942. Just 6 years after, what happened to the three figures I was referring to? And on this screen, you see this is a famous picture in which Chairman Mao just finished, I'm not sure whether this is the first or third or second or third lecture, 3 talks at Yan'an, right? And he was taking a group picture with the listeners, the audiences of his talk. It was through the 3 talks given by Mao in Yan'an from May 3rd to May 24th, 1942, the whole Chinese literary policy was sort of mandated and implemented for the decades to come. And through the articulation or utterance of the 3 talks, Chairman Mao was able to establish himself not merely as a leader of Chinese politics and the revolution, but also the leader of Chinese literature and cultural policy. And let me just tell you that among the audience, there was a young cadre officer. His name was none other than He Qifang, the third young person, this young man. What happened to him was that by 1936, He Qifang, although enjoying his great reputation or popularity among his readers, although life was good, he felt very discontented with his own identity. When the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out next year, 1937, He Qifang decided to leave Beijing, first back to his hometown region in Sichuan, and eventually he felt he needed a bigger call. He needed to answer a bigger call of his time. So in 1938, in August, he took a trip on foot for 17 days, walking from Sichuan all the way to Yan'an. And there, he had a chance to meet with Chairman Mao. And Chairman Mao asked this young writer or young poet, what can literature do at this moment of history? There must be something you guys can do, and that we can do. This is referring to himself and other fellow revolutionaries. He Qifang was overwhelmed by Chairman Mao's talk, and in 3 days, he decided that he wanted to become a dedicated Chinese communist revolutionary. And indeed, he was sworn in as a party member very, very quickly. And in the next 12, 13 years, he would emerge to become one of the most important so-called cultural workers under the wing of Chairman Mao's Yan'an regime. And so therefore, in 1942, He Qifang was in the audience, and he was so moved by Chairman Mao's talk that he felt there was a tremendous need for him to confess and therefore to transform himself. And here we have one of the most famous poems He Qifang wrote at the time. The title of the poem is none other than Explain Myself. So I describe this kind of a literary engagement as a kind of engagement motivated by a kind of exegetical mandate and followed by a kind of a bounding formed by those who confess to each other and eventually form a new kind of a solidarity, exegetical bounding. And in this poem, I only highlight some of the most striking moments. Here I read in English, and also I have Chinese here, the English in red. I will bury myself with the old world and joyfully experience my painful rebirth. 的再一次的痛苦的投生. So the whole transformation is being referred to almost like a kind of a religious baptism. And through this kind of religious kind of a conversion, a new life was being born. And above all, He Qifang argued that for us who had been contaminated or polluted by the traditional or bourgeois societies, we want to surrender. We want to lay down arms altogether. In Chinese, 缴械, that's really a very threatening term of surrender. We just give up everything so as to succumb to the new call of this Maoist political manifesto, Yan'an Talks, as opposed to the conversion being sort of undertaken or being undergone painfully by these urban intellectual youths who found a new life in Yan'an. Of course, there's another kind of a sort of artistic performance and cultural engagement being cooked up by a new group of cultural workers based in Yan'an. Here, I only cite White Hair Girl, which premiered in the year 1945. As the slogan goes, White Girl Go refers to this moral lesson we should all learn from the revolution. That is, the old society turns humans into ghosts. The liberated society turns the ghosts back into humans. Again, we are talking about conversion, talking about transformation, and talking about metamorphosis. And so, again, this is a truly a kind of dynamic and exciting moment for these revolutionaries. But I want to argue here that for those intellectuals who traveled to Yan'an seeking some kind of opportunity of being reborn, the trial was never easy. At one point, He Qifang was confessing that I am a centaur. I am just that kind of incredible monster. I don't know how to truly transform myself into a total new human being. So this kind of pain and this kind of a guilty conscience will haunt He Qifang in the decades to come till the moment of his death. But on the other hand, I'm introducing now Feng Zhi, the gentleman who traveled to Germany to study Goethe and Rilke for 6 years, coming back in 1936. And here, however, he has a different story to tell us. Not like He Qifang, Feng Zhi did not go to Yan'an. Actually, he followed the nationalist regime to Kunming, and he was a professor teaching Germanic literature at Southwestern Associated University during the wartime. During the same time, he was still composing. He was still writing more and more very refined poems reflecting upon national fate and for its personal choice. But even then, Feng Zhi was undergoing a kind of rethinking of his status as an intellectual and as a poet. And the result, 1946, Feng Zhi came out to argue that I feel now I am like a homunculus. I wanted to seek for some kind of a transformation. I want to be a new man. And this homunculus actually was being seen in Feng Zhi's article, which was published in 1946, titled "The Homunculus in Faust" on Goethe's natural science. And here, I just give a quick explanation about what this homunculus means to Feng Zhi at that time. For those who are familiar with Goethe's Faust, in part 2, homunculus was featured as that young, perfect, miniature human being who would eventually guide Faust to meet with Greek gods. This is a kind of perfect sort of a artificial human being. Everything looks great, just a tiny, small, kind of very cute, kind of in size. But the homunculus has one sort of kind of a drawback. That is, this homunculus has to survive in a kind of artificially sort of insular flask. Because it was produced in fire, it cannot withstand the challenges of all natural powers. It can only become true human or real human beings when homunculus being united with water element, the origin of life. So Feng Zhi, who started out being a believer in Goethe and Rilke, whose theories are certainly a far cry from Chairman Mao's Yan'an talks, which Mao gave in 1942. One now want to wonder what happened to Feng Zhi between 1942 and 1946. What happened to him in such a way that he wanted to drop his learnings in Heidelberg, his learnings about Goethe and the Rilke, and of course now he wanted to convert himself to a believer in Mao's Yan'an talks. And the image he was referring to was very ironically from Faust. And he wanted to compare himself to this kind of homunculus, a kind of 人造人 in Chinese, man-made man or new man. So probably was not too much a surprise then in 1949 on February 23rd when People's Liberation Army sort of finally marched into the Beijing or Beiping city. Feng Zhi was seen in the front row of the Beijing University delegation of professors and students welcoming PLA's sort of occupation of this ancient city. So it probably wasn't too much a surprise for us to read a poem like this in 1952. And here, Feng Zhi was saying that, probably I should read in Chinese this time because this is really a kind of intriguing poem. 你让祖国的山川变得这样美丽清新，你让人人都恢复了青春，你让我一个知识分子又有了良心。I used not to have conscience, but now I have conscience. 你是我们再生的父母，你是我们永久的恩人。You give birth to us anew. You are our benefactor forever. And of course, this was Feng Zhi's celebration of Chairman Mao's leadership. And this Feng Zhi, as a kind of a self-appointed Maoist version of a homunculus, right? That this is a moment where he felt he has turned himself into a completely new human being. But come to think of Lu Xun's praise for Feng Zhi in 1930s, that Feng Zhi was being the best lyricist in modern China. I'm not sure whether a poem like this would help him sort of further his reputation as the best lyricist in modern China. But still, such a kind of poetic articulation bespoke the ethos of that time, that an intellectual such as Feng Zhi would have to either sincerely or not so sincerely expressing himself in response to the changing circumstances. So to conclude this part, I want to suggest that 1949, from July 2nd to the 19th, when the first Congress of Literary and Art Workers was being called, or being sort of summoned in Beijing, this marked the transitional moment, the turning moment of the nature of modern Chinese literary culture. And here, a kind of sort of homunculi, a kind of a group of a dedicated sort of newborn man and women now trying hard to pledge their allegiance to this forthcoming regime. And of course, for their decision, they would eventually pay different kind of prices, sometimes not very pleasant prices. And here, we give only two examples. And we still remember Hu Feng, who was a writer and a politician and a poet who composed the famous poem on October 1st, the national day, the founding day of the new nation, the People's Republic of China. 时间开始了, time begins, in 1949. In 5 years, he would, of course, be purged by Chairman Mao, and he and his followers would suffer tremendously in the decades to come. And also, we remember this lady, Ding Ling, who at one time enjoyed wild popularity in 1920s and 1930s as the sort of a token, sort of a new woman at the time. Eventually, she went to Yan'an and she became a woman cadre at that time. And then, of course, she became a high-ranking sort of bureaucratic officer in 1950s. And then same year, 1955, saw the downfall of Ding Ling. And for her conversion, she would be exiled for 24 years, from late 1950s to late 1970s. So what is the price for transforming yourself into a new woman and a new man? And what are the deal? What are the deals involved here? These are the questions we probably want to think and further discuss later. And to conclude this part, I just throw out these questions for us to think about. People's literature, 人民文学 or 人民的文学, is this for democracy or hegemony? This is for volitionism or instrumentalism? Popular culture or populist culture? Utopia or dystopia? Sorry for the typo. D-Y, S-T-O-P-I-A. So these are the questions which probably are still important for us today when we look back at the ups and the downs of a people's literature over the past 5 or 6 decades. And here we also want to find out how the homunculi in the Maoist regime try to learn and refashion themselves again and again and again. And here we refer to the 5 knives, like surgery knives, Hu Feng enumerated in early 1950s in critiquing this new whole idea of writing in the new China. And we also have a fiction written like manuals, right? How to train yourself to become great new citizen, or in my terminology, to become great new Maoist homunculi like a 青春之歌 or 青春万岁, right? Song of Youth, Long Live Youth by writers such as Yang Mo and Wang Meng. Again, fiction or literature is not just merely for the sake of entertainment. It's for the sake of education, self-education, and of course, habilitation and rehabilitation. And during the same time, we see someone like Eileen Chang, who chose to exile herself also in the year 1952 when Feng Zhi wrote this famous poem, 我的感谢. She chose first to go to Hong Kong, and eventually she went to the United States. Would this be a better option for that generation of literati and writers? Well, that's a question we probably can think about later. Now, I come to the third part, Nobel. Everybody, of course, know who he is. And I wanted to just conclude today's presentation, again, by going over several factors involving the century-long pursuit of or obsession with the Nobel Prize, and then end with a couple of observations and questions. We surely know who he is, Mr. Mo Yan, the Nobel Literary Prize laureate 2012. And his books, and so on and so forth. We surely still remember him, Mr. Gao Xingjian, who won the prize in the year 2000. And of course, Professor Julia Lovell has written very powerfully about the whole cultural capital of the Nobel Prize being in circulation in the preceding decades, culminated in Gao Xingjian's receiving prize, and at the same time, Chinese government came out to say, we don't know who he is. He's a French, right? He has nothing to do with China, and therefore has nothing to do with Chinese literature. And controversies like this seems to indicate that Nobel Prize was a kind of prickly issue for Chinese readers and writers, and particularly governmental leaders. And the fact, however, is ever since 1927, the Nobel Prize had been a kind of focus of a continued argument about who should win it, who shouldn't, and why we shouldn't win it, and so on and so forth. And believe it or not, Lu Xun at that time, 1927, was actually being approached, right, to consider the possibility of a nomination. And Lu Xun just turned it down. And he felt that none of us Chinese writers is eligible for this the Nobel Prize. So let it go. And of course, the original nominator, or the person who make it propose, is the famous archaeologist Sven Hedden, right? And later on, writers such as Lao She, a writer such as Shen Congwen, who we haven't mentioned him too much, but he will be the topic of my lecture on Thursday. These people had been sort of either nominated or allegedly nominated for the prize. The point is that for many, many decades, Nobel or Nobel Prize was that kind of a haunting thing, tantalizing but never accessible for generations of Chinese people. And then the point is, after Nobel Prize was being given to Mo Yan in the year of 2012, of course Chinese people were really happy about this the outcome, as if justice was finally done. And then at the same time, you just couldn't help noticing this strange sort of letdown or anticlimax shared by Chinese readers and perhaps to a certain extent even governmental leaders. But the Chinese were not supposed to win the Nobel, and therefore we can happily indulge ourselves in our sort of a sadomasochistic complex, right? We are being so hated by the world, and we don't deserve it, or we're never good enough. Now, Mo Yan, my colleague, got a prize. You can imagine all the other fellow writers fell, right? This is sour grape, sort of a very bizarre kind of sort of effect running around. It's just really very, very strange. To say nothing of the fact that the same year, 2012, May, when the 70th anniversary of Chairman Mao's Yan'an talks was being commemorated by such a press, one leading press, as having contemporary writers handwrite 誊写, 抄写 Chairman Mao's talks, verbatim, word for word. And Mo Yan was one of those who handwrote Mao's one segment of Mao's talks. And for many detractors, attackers, Mo Yan being the prize winner, this is the ultimate piece of evidence. How could Nobel Prize committee give the prize to somebody who was siding with a regime, PRC? But the same kind of argument from the other side would be, well, Mo Yan was mere a writer, right? He was merely just transcribing and copying. And according to Mo Yan himself, Chairman Mao's talks, however debatable, definitely had its own historical significance, given the 1942 historical context. So Mo Yan is excusable. So lots of a debate about the qualification of Mo Yan probably still is going on to date. No matter what, the point is that to date, probably when we go to China, when we talk about the value of a Nobel Prize, I bet you my Chinese students and colleagues wouldn't have sounded as anxious as they were 10 years ago. It's gone. It's the whole charm or enchantment or whatever gone. Right? That's probably the most unexpected anticlimax we are talking about. But let me just conclude my lecture by giving you the following pieces of evidence as to the Chinese yearning for a literary prize. The first prize, actually, according to my former colleague, Professor Patrick Hannon, was actually being announced on May 25th, 1895, by a British scholar, Fu Lanyang, or John Fryer, who was professing or publicizing a prize among young Chinese scholars in the genre of fiction, in the hope that these scholars can contribute fiction to help reform Chinese culture. So actually, almost 15 years before Lu Xun came to the scene, and a British scholar was actually responsible for the whole sort of culture of reforming China through literature. And I want to share with you the next image. That is, in 1951, Ding Ling and Zhou Libo were winners of a Stalin Literary Prize, second and third degrees. So at that time, certainly Nobel was no big deal. Stalin sells, right? And people really felt Ding Ling was winning this prize for the nation, representing the climax of the excellence of literature in the new regime. But then I want to argue that today we don't really worry Nobel or whatever because we have got too many prizes. I checked online for this talk. There are right now at least more than 100 literary prizes being given every year in all kinds of names to Chinese writers, from Lu Xun all the way down to Renmin Wenxue to Xingjian and so on and so forth. So all these are prize names, including Ba Jin, Yu Dafu, Cao Yu, and so on and so forth, Ding Ling, and of course, everybody. And of course, how can we forget Chairman Mao? So in Hunan, we have a Mao Zedong Literary Prize. But very sadly, we have never heard too much about this prize. And we don't know who the winners were over the past decades. Instead, probably we hear more nowadays talking about literature prize. How about Han Han, right? He was the winner of 新概念, this one, 新概念作文比赛. That was the 1999. Han Han was only 16 years old and a high school dropout, and yet he wrote so well as to draw the attention of the jurors. The result, he won the prize, and ever since then, Han Han has become a new national legend, even today, right? This is one of the greatest and the most popular writers plus public intellectuals in China. But what about him, Guo Jingming, who also won 新概念, New Literary Concept Literary Prize, and in the year 2001 and 2002. And we now know Guo Jingming probably is not just merely an icon, right? He's really a commercial label, right? When we invoke Guo Jingming, we know this is a billionaire because he was a literature writer. And also he was a film producer and all kinds of things. So talking about the price, what are we talking about it after all? What are we talking about the value invested in a prize such as either Nobel or a new concept and so on and so forth? And all these women writers in one way or another are involved in different kinds of literary prizes, right? But above all, I want to say that for millions of Chinese people, they at one time were fanatic consumers of one literature. That's Chairman Mao's famous quotes, Mao Yu Lu, right? At that time, everybody who was reading this piece of literature was tremendously inspired by it. And of course, in 1989, another kind of literature was being put into circulation on Tiananmen Square. And that literature has only two Chinese characters, that is Minzhu, or democracy. And this literature was being uttered in different kinds of forms, in even corporeal forms, such as hunger strike, or in songs, in all kinds of literary sort of articulations of poetry and so on and so forth. So at that moment, Tiananmen was that venue, was that platform on which different kind of sort of ideas about what literature could be or could do was being contested. But again, today, when we talk about the people, we don't just merely talk about Chairman Mao's people. We're talking about the millions of netizens on the internet. We're talking about Chinese population of netizens. As of December 2013, 600 millions. And by the end of this year, more than 700 millions. These are the people who really gave a force and gave a say about what literature can be or can do. I conclude with this. Isn't this a very literary invocation when we talk about China's dream or Chinese dreams? Last year, when Prime Minister or President Xi Jinping came up with 中国梦, I was really pleased because finally, this is something we literature people can really talk about. After all, dream, that's the most ancient motif in our literary survey of whatever kind of literature, right? And to conclude, one more time, I just present again 6 pictures, 6 images for us to think about at this moment, who is that Mara? Who is that Mara, or do we really care about Mara? And in an age when Maoism has been totally taken care of, taken over by Mammonism or by Mammon. Or we don't talk about Mara anymore. We talk about Avatar, but not Avatar in Hindu sense, but Avatar in the sense of a Hollywood picture, James Cameron's the big box office in China. So after 100-some years, we are still thinking about Mara, the power of literature. And as a literature student, I still believe in the power of literature, and whether this power comes from, say, Liang Qichao, or Lu Xun, or Chairman Mao, or Feng Zhi, or Mo Yan, or probably from even Guo Jingming. So the unpredictable power of literature is not something I'm fighting for and what I'm trying to define. Thank you very much.